"Thank you for your service, old-timer." Logan Pryce said it with a grin, the kind of grin that doesn't mean what the words mean. He was pointing his phone sideways, framing the shot the way he always did when something struck him as content. "You look like you really earned it." His two friends laughed. One of them, a kid named Bryce, who wore a set of purchased medals pinned to a brand new field jacket, nudged the other. The three of them had been filming in the VA waiting room for the better part of 40 minutes, doing what Logan called military appreciation content, saluting each other, reciting butchered cadences, trying on the language of service like a costume that didn't quite fit. The old man they were pointing at sat in a plastic chair against the far wall. He hadn't looked up. His name was Harmon Paul Gatch, and he was 71 years old, and he had been sitting in that same chair in the Clement J. Zablocki VA Medical Center in Milwaukee every third Monday for the past 4 years, not because he wanted to, because his left knee required it, and because the pharmacist here knew his chart, and because the coffee in the machine by the elevators was bad, but it was hot and it was free. He wore a grey flannel shirt tucked into dark work pants. No jacket, no insignia, no unit cap, no bumper sticker on his truck, no flag in the yard of the small house on Garfield Avenue, where he lived alone with a tomato plant on the back porch and a television he only turned on for weather. His hair was mostly dark still, cut short and neat, going to salt at the temples. He was not the man you would picture when someone said the word veteran. He looked like a retired school teacher. He looked like someone's quiet uncle. He looked like a man who had made peace with being invisible, which he had a long time ago. He did not respond to Logan Pryce. He wrapped both hands around his paper cup and looked at the floor. Logan stepped closer, phone still up. "Seriously, what branch, what years?" Bryce leaned into frame. "He's probably like National Guard, you know, weekend warrior type." This got another round of laughter. The waiting room was perhaps 30 people deep. A young mother with 2 kids on her lap, an amputee veteran in his 40s reading a magazine, a clerk at the front desk who had watched Logan's group come in and chosen, very deliberately, not to engage. Now she watched again, the pencil in her hand gone still. Harmon Gatch looked up just once. His eyes met Logan's for a moment, dark, calm, measuring, and then went back to the floor. "I'm waiting on a prescription," he said. That was all. Logan widened his eyes for the camera. "Can you believe this guy?" he mouthed. Bryce snorted. The third friend, who hadn't said much, shifted his weight and looked toward the door. What none of them knew, what none of them had thought to ask, had thought to consider, had thought at all, was that Harmon Paul Gatch had served 23 years in the United States Army, that he had deployed to Saudi Arabia in August of 1990 and crossed into Kuwait with the 1st Cavalry Division in the ground campaign of Desert Storm, that he had returned from that war to find his younger brother in a box, killed by a drunk driver on Route 41, while Harmon was overseas and unable to come home, that he had gone back in 2003 at the age of 48, one of the oldest senior NCOs in his battalion, because the younger soldiers going in were his soldiers, and he intended to bring them home, that his left knee was what it was because of a vehicle rollover outside Tikrit in 2004, the same rollover that killed Corporal Jameson Wiley, 19 years old, from Decatur, Illinois, whose mother Harmon still called on the 3rd Sunday of every November because that was the date Jameson had enlisted, and someone needed to remember it with her. None of them knew any of this, they hadn't asked. Logan was still filming when the door from the main corridor opened and a woman in her early 50s walked in. She wore civilian clothes, a blazer, dark slacks, but she carried herself the way people do when authority has become bone deep, when rank is no longer a thing you put on in the morning, but something that remade you over decades until it was simply the shape of your spine. She was Colonel Adrian Steed, United States Army, retired 14 months. She had commanded an aviation brigade in Germany. Before that, she had served 2 deployments in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, and before that she had been a young captain who once sat in a forward operating base outside Fallujah and listened to a master sergeant named Gatch explain to a room of shaking soldiers, the night before a major operation, that fear was not the enemy, that fear was information, and that the difference between a soldier and a civilian was not the absence of fear, but the decision about what to do with it. She had never forgotten that briefing. She had given versions of it herself, over the years, to her own soldiers. She had quoted it without attribution, because she didn't know if Gatch had made it up himself or heard it somewhere, and because it deserved to be passed on regardless. She almost didn't see him. And then she did. He was sitting against the far wall in a grey flannel shirt with his hands around a paper cup, and a group of young men with costume medals were pointing a phone at him, and her step faltered. It wasn't the face, exactly, though the face was familiar. It was the posture, the absolute stillness, the way he held his shoulders under the weight of being mocked without letting any of it show, without retreating, without rising to it. She had seen that posture once before on a man who had spent 23 years learning when to speak and when to let silence do the work. She crossed the waiting room. Logan barely registered her until she was standing between him and Harmon's chair, and by then it was too late to adjust the frame or the tone or the expression on his face. "Put the phone down," she said. Not loud, not angry, the same way you might say, "Don't touch that stove." Logan lowered it slightly. "We're just making content, ma'am. Military appreciation." "Put it down." He put it down. She turned to look at Harmon. He was watching her now, and something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition. Then a flicker of something that might have been reluctance, as if he had hoped to avoid exactly this. "Master Sergeant Gatch," she said. He gave a single nod. "Ma'am." She turned back to Logan. For a long moment she simply looked at him, at the purchased medals, the posed toughness, the phone half raised again out of reflex. "Do you know who this man is?" Logan glanced at his friends. No, he didn't want to say. "He never does." She said it without bitterness. "That's not a criticism of you, specifically. I want you to understand that. It's an observation about who he is." She pulled a chair from the nearest row and sat down as if she had all the time in the world. "When I was a captain in Fallujah, I was scared. I don't say that easily. I was scared in a way I had never felt before and haven't quite felt since. The kind of scared where you can't trust your own hands. The night before an operation that I genuinely did not believe I would come back from, a master sergeant I barely knew sat in front of my company and talked for 20 minutes about the difference between fear and failure. He didn't pretend the fear wasn't real. He didn't give us a speech about glory or country. He just explained fear the way a mechanic explains an engine. Here's what it is. Here's what it does. Here's how you work with it instead of against it." She paused. "I've given some version of that briefing maybe 30 times in my career. I gave it to my own soldiers the night before we went into Kandahar. Every one of them came home. I don't know how much credit belongs to a speech, but I know I didn't give it. I borrowed it from him." The waiting room was very quiet. Logan Pryce was not a bad person. That's the thing about these moments. The people in them are rarely monsters. He was 24 years old, and he made content because he was good at making content, and he had grown up watching military tribute videos that performed patriotism in clean, edited packages, and he had confused the packaging for the thing itself. He was looking at Harmon Gatch now as if seeing him for the first time, which he was. "I didn't know," Logan said. His voice was different, smaller. "I know you didn't." Colonel Steed folded her hands. "That's not an excuse, it's a starting point." At the front desk, the clerk had set down her pencil. Her name was Renata, and she had worked this desk for 9 years, and she had checked Harmon Gatch in on the 3rd Monday of the month for most of that time, and she had never asked him much beyond his date of birth and his insurance card. She was thinking about that now. She was thinking about the way he always said thank you when she handed back his paperwork, not perfunctorily, but actually, as if the small transaction meant something to him. She was thinking about how last December, when she had come in to find her car battery dead in the parking lot, it had been Harmon, who was leaving as she arrived, who had no reason to stay, who had waited with her for 40 minutes in the cold until her husband came, because he'd said he didn't feel right leaving her alone in an empty lot in the dark. She hadn't known what he'd done in his life. She hadn't known about Desert Storm or Tikrit or Corporal Jameson Wiley or the knee or any of it. She had just thought, quiet man, always says thank you, waited with me in the cold. She found herself thinking that maybe that was enough to know. Maybe that was everything. Harmon Gatch stood up slowly, his knee doing what his knee did. He faced Logan Pryce. The young man looked away first, then made himself look back. "You want to make military content," Harmon said. Not a question. His voice was the kind of voice that had given orders without needing to raise itself. "Then go to a VA and listen. not film. Listen, sit next to someone and ask them what they need, and when they tell you, help them get it. Help them fill out forms they can't understand anymore. Drive someone to an appointment whose family lives 2 hours away. Sit with someone who's scared about a diagnosis and can't call anyone because they don't want to worry their kids. He paused. That won't get you views, but it'll get you something real. Logan opened his mouth, closed it, nodded. I'm not angry at you, Harmon said. You didn't, now you do. He turned to Colonel Steed. Something passed between them. Not a look of shared history exactly, more like a shared understanding that some things don't need ceremony. He gave her the same single nod he had given before. Good to see you, Colonel. Good to see you, Master Sergeant. He picked up his paper cup, finished the last of the cold coffee, and dropped it in the trash on his way to the pharmacy window. Logan Pryce did not post the video he'd filmed that day. He sat in his car in the VA parking lot for a long time, going through the footage, and then he deleted it. Not because he was afraid of the comments, though he probably would have been, but because something had shifted inside him in a way he couldn't yet explain and didn't want to make into content before he understood it. What he did instead, 3 weeks later, was call the Milwaukee VA and ask if they needed volunteers to help patients with transportation. They did. He started driving on Saturday mornings. He didn't post about it, he didn't film it. One of the men he drove regularly was a Korean War veteran named Edmund, who was 91 years old, and had opinions about the Brewers that Logan found both baffling and fascinating. And after a while he started looking forward to those Saturday mornings more than anything he filmed during the week. He never saw Harmon Gatch again. But months later, at a small gathering of volunteers, the VA put together Say Thank You. An older nurse who had been there for 15 years told a story about a patient who had quietly, over the course of 7 years, helped 17 different VA families navigate PTSD treatment and survivor benefits and burial claims, all without fanfare, all without being asked, all without ever telling anyone at the VA what he was doing. She didn't name him. She said he'd asked her not to. Logan knew. Renata, back at the front desk, heard the story secondhand from a colleague, and she thought about cold parking lots and dead batteries, and a man who waited in the dark because he didn't feel right leaving someone alone. She pulled up Harmon's file that afternoon, not for any official reason, just to know his full name. Harmon Paul Gatch, it said. Service, United States Army, 1974-1997, retired. Additional deployment, 2003-2004. 2 lines, 23 years. 1 rollover outside Tikrit that nobody talked about anymore, and a phone call to a mother in Degeta every 3rd Sunday of November. She closed the file, thought for a moment, then wrote his name down on a small piece of paper and put it in her desk drawer. She wasn't sure why. Maybe so that the next time he came in on the 3rd Monday and handed her his insurance card and said, "Thank you," in that way he had, she would remember that she was handing it back to someone whose quiet was not emptiness, but depth, whose stillness was not absence, but the specific, cultivated calm of a man who had learned, in sand and smoke and long drives through a foreign dark, what was worth fighting for and what was worth letting go. Harmon Gatch drove home that Monday on the same route he always took, stopped at the hardware store on Clement for a new washer for the kitchen faucet, and spent the afternoon fixing it. He made a sandwich. He watched the weather. He went to bed early because his knee was bad, and because the tomato plant on the back porch was coming along, and he wanted to check on it in the morning light. He did not think about Logan Pryce. He did not think about Colonel Steed's words or Renata's eyes on him as he left, or whether anyone in that waiting room would remember what had happened. He had learned a long time ago that recognition, when it comes on its own schedule and for its own reasons, and that a man who serves in order to be remembered has misunderstood service entirely. The patch, the one real marker he carried, worn and small and stitched with thread that had faded from its original colours, was on the inside breast pocket of his flannel shirt. It had been there for decades. Some mornings he put his hand against it without thinking, just a habit, the way a man checks his keys. Some mornings he didn't think about it at all. He had earned it in ways he did not talk about, in a country he had crossed at night, in a war that the country had mostly moved on from, among brothers who were mostly gone. He wore it the way he wore his own name, quietly, without announcement, simply because it was his and because it was true. That was enough. It had always been enough.